Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into the recent Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting. Happened in Dallas.
Right. We've got these sources, news articles mostly, covering what went down.
And we're looking at what happened with the thousands of messengers. That's their term for the church delegates who were there.
Yeah.
Our mission really is just to pull out the key takeaways from these articles. They cover the big decisions, the controversies, and also some really somber news about abuse survivors.
Think of it as, a way to get up to speed quickly on what's going on inside the SBC right now. It's pretty complex stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We'll look at the resolutions they passed, the social, ethical stuff, and also the internal debates, the things they didn't agree on.
In that ongoing struggle with the legacy of abuse, it all helps paint a picture, right, of the denomination today.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The sources cover such a wide range. You've got votes on these deeply felt issues, marriage, gender identity.
Yeah, the big cultural topics.
But also resolutions on things like sports betting, pornography.
Things you might not immediately associate, but they're clearly priorities.
And then the internal stuff, too. That push to abolish the ERLC, their public policy arm.
Right. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, that's a recurring fight.
And the debate over women serving as pastors. That came up again.
It did. And like you said, woven through all of this is the really tough news about abuse survivors, the conversation about reform, or maybe the lack of it.
So we'll use the details from the sources to try to give you a clear picture of what happened and, why it matters.
Okay.
Let's start with the context that, according to the sources, really cast a shadow over the meeting, the abuse issue, and specifically the tragic death of Jennifer Lyell.
Yeah, that news broke just before the meeting, I believe. She died at only 47 from massive strokes.
It's just incredibly sad. The sources give some background on her. She came to faith a bit later, went to seminary, wanted to be a missionary.
And she rose really quickly at Lifeway, that's the SBC's publishing house, became quite a high-ranking executive involved in major book projects.
Real success story by any measure.
Right. Until the experience she alleged.
Yeah. According to the sources, back in 2004, when she was at seminary, she met David Sills. He was a professor, older, became a kind of mentor.
Mm-hmm.
Then, years later, in 2018, she reported to her bosses at Lifeway. She alleged that Sills had used force, his spiritual authority, to coerce her into non-consensual sexual acts over a 12-year period.
And the fallout from that, it was quick, but also really messy.
How so?
Well, Sills reportedly admitted some misconduct and resigned from his seminary position. But the specific details weren't widely known at first.
Okay.
It was only later, when he apparently found another job, that Lyell decided she had to go public. She shared her story with Baptist Press, the SBC's official news service.
And this is where, based on the reporting, things got even harder for her.
Yeah. That initial Baptist Press article, it described it as a morally inappropriate relationship. Didn't use the word abuse.
Wow.
They did retract it later and apologized. But the sources suggest, the damage was done.
Right, because she faced a huge backlash, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely. The articles mention her being called a temptress, blamed for leading a leader astray, just showered with hate, apparently.
People calling for her to be fired.
Pastors, churches, yeah. And there was a journalist, an activist type, who published something questioning her story. It was brutal. She ended up leaving Lifeway in the midst of all that.
It just highlights the incredible burden survivors carry. Not just the trauma itself, but the reaction when they speak out.
One source mentioned she even expressed regret in an interview back in 2021 about coming forward. Said it was just so draining trying to recover while having to constantly explain and defend herself publicly.
And this whole situation, her case and others, that directly led to the Big Guidepost Solutions Report in 2022, right?
Exactly. That was the independent investigation the SBC commissioned. And it found leaders had mishandled abuse cases, mistreated survivors. It was supposed to be a watershed moment for reform.
But even that report caused more problems for Lyell personally.
It seems so. The sources say Sills actually sued the SBC, some leaders, and Lyell after the Guidepost report. Claimed he was being made a scapegoat.
Unbelievable. How did she respond?
The articles mention a social media post she made, said something like, "I do not need to be under oath to tell the truth, and there are no lies that will shake my certainty of what is true."
Wow.
And apparently, in a deposition earlier this year, she went into detail about the alleged abuse, even how the Bible was supposedly used to silence her, just steadfast.
Her friends, other survivors, they shared some really touching things after she died. Rachel Denhollander?
Yeah, quoted saying Lyell passed gently into the arms of her Redeemer. Others mentioned how much she inspired them, how she was so much more than what happened to her.
Megan Lively, another survivor, mentioned Lyell loved Rich Mullins' music, the show West Wing, that she wrote a children's Bible storybook,
Yeah.
just trying to paint a fuller picture.
Right. That she loved her Savior, was a Sunday school teacher, and was, as Lively put it, at peace. It's important to remember the person.
Definitely. And the timing of her death, the sources note, feels significant. It comes just as the momentum for those abuse reforms, sparked by the Guidepost report, seems to have stalled.
Yeah, that's the sense you get from the reporting. Like the plan for a database of credibly accused abusers, that hasn't really gone anywhere.
And she wasn't the only survivor whose death was noted around the meeting time. Gerald Dwayne Rollins.
Right. His allegations were also key in bringing all this to light. He passed away earlier in the spring.
It's worth noting the SBC Executive Committee did apologize back in 2022, acknowledged failing Lyell, the bad reporting by Baptist Press.
They did, but still, the sources mentioned some survivors and advocates skipped this year's meeting, felt there wasn't enough progress.
While others were there, holding vigils outside, carrying pictures of Lyell and Rollins.
Yeah, so that's the heavy backdrop for this meeting.
Okay. So, despite that really somber context, the convention still had its business to conduct. Resolutions were passed. What did the articles highlight there?
Right. Moving to the floor actions. They adopted several resolutions. Now, these are technically non-binding, just statements of belief or position.
Got it.
But one was a really big deal. Resolution number 5.
Ah, yes, the huge one, like
Oh.
1,000 words, titled On Restoring Moral Clarity Through God's Design for Gender, Marriage, and the Family.
That's the one. And the sources say it passed very easily, without notable opposition among the 10,000-plus messengers.
So, strong consensus on this one. What did it cover?
It basically bundled together statements on 9 different topics, all under this umbrella idea of created order.
Okay, what's that?
The resolution bases it on scripture, Genesis mainly, and also nature. It argues there are universal truths about male and female difference, that it's not accidental or arbitrary, equal worth, but different by design.
And the sources point out this view is pretty standard within the SBC, but maybe not shared by all other Christian groups.
Exactly. And one critic quoted Brian Henderson from a group called Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, basically said, this framing ignores complexity, science, human relations, suggests only the SBC gets it right, shows the divide.
Okay, so what are some specifics in this big resolution?
Well, defines marriage strictly, lifelong, one man, one woman, calls for overturning laws and court rulings that contradict that, specifically naming Obergefell v. Hodges, the same-sex marriage ruling.
They want that gone.
Yes, and they also want laws passed that affirm marriage as only between one man and one woman. The articles do clarify, though, that just overturning Obergefell wouldn't be a nationwide ban. It would go back to the states.
Right. What else?
Human life is sacred, conception to natural death, calls for equal protection under law, family is foundational, comes before the state, mandate to be fruitful and multiply, parents have primary responsibility for kids.
So affirming traditional views on life and family structure.
Very much so. And it then criticizes current culture for rejecting these things, points to redefining marriage, what it calls willful childlessness.
Willful childlessness. Interesting phrasing.
Yeah, links it to declining fertility. Also criticizes ignoring biological differences, encouraging gender confusion, undermining parental rights.
It also mentioned surrogacy, right?
It did. Commercial surrogacy. Says it often treats children like products, women as means to an end, might involve destroying embryos, violates dignity, distorts procreation, according to the resolution.
And transgender issues. A big focus, I imagine.
Definitely. It calls the normalization of transgender ideology, especially things like biological males in girl sports, medical transitions for minors, calls it rebellion against God's design.
Strong language.
Says it harms kids and women, uses coercive language control, undermines fairness, safety, truth. Also raises concerns about free speech being threatened if people are forced to speak against their conscience on sex or identity.
So it lays out the problems as they see them. Does it propose solutions?
Yes, it says lawmakers have a duty to pass laws reflecting this truth of creation and oppose laws that deny it. Calls for specific laws. affirming marriage as one man-woman, recognizing biological sex, protecting kids, parental rights, incentivizing families, ensuring fairness in women's sports.
A pretty comprehensive agenda.
It is. And then interestingly, right after all that, there's a line saying, "We call on Southern Baptists to love all of their neighbors in accordance with their God-given dignity as image bearers."
Okay, so the call to love alongside the strong stances. What other resolutions passed?
They condemned sports betting, called it predatory, especially targeting young adults, the poor, those with addictions.
Calls for government regulation.
Yes, and for Baptists not to participate. The sources note this industry is huge now, like $13.7 billion since a Supreme Court decision in 2018 opened the doors.
Yeah, you see the ads everywhere.
One pastor quoted, Kyle Worley, said its growth raises the stakes for Christian leaders needing to address it.
Okay, what else? Pornography.
Another strong one there. Calling for comprehensive laws to ban creating, publishing, hosting, distributing porn in all media. The goal stated is to eradicate pornography nationwide.
Wow, eradicate. That's ambitious.
Very. It commended a federal act called Take It Down, which deals with child abuse material online, and also asked for protection from AI-generated porn.
It's interesting. One source mentioned research suggesting Christians aren't actually that different from other Americans in viewing porn as potentially healthy. Quite a contrast to the SBC stance.
A stark contrast, yeah. Shows the gap between official positions and maybe lived reality for some.
And one more. Abortion pills.
Right. A resolution favoring government restrictions on chemical abortion pills, asking for state and national bans, and for the FDA to revoke approval for mifepristone.
Citing safety concerns.
Yeah, citing a study about underreported medical risks. And these pills are common now, right? The sources say they account for like 63% of abortions.
So these resolutions touch on issues the ERLC, their policy arm, has worked on before.
Makes sense. The sources connect it, mentioning ERLC work on sports gambling, age verification for porn sites. The ERLC president, Brent Leatherwood, is quoted saying there needs to be a Baptist voice on these things in the public square.
Okay, so those are the resolutions that passed, showing areas of, well, pretty strong agreement among the messengers.
Right. Broad consensus there.
But what about the things that didn't pass? The articles mention some significant internal reforms or changes that failed.
Yeah, that's the other side of the coin. Messengers didn't enact major internal changes this time around.
Like the ERLC that came up again?
It did. The push to abolish the ERLC entirely. This was the fourth year, apparently, that it faced a challenge like this, and the vote was pretty significant. Over 40% wanted to shut it down.
40% is a lot. Why do critics want it gone?
The argument, going back several years now, especially since Trump's first campaign, is that the ERLC is just not aligned with the political views or interests of many SBC churches.
Citing what specifically?
Things like the ERLC's stances on immigration, sometimes on gun control discussions, even nuances on abortion strategy. The sources mention critics linked to a group called the Center for Baptist Leadership, pushing for Brent Leatherwood, the ERLC president, to step down.
How did the ERLC respond?
The board chair, Scott Foshee, put out a statement saying, basically, "We hear the concerns, we're committed to listening, trying to bridge the gap."
And former ERLC president Richard Land weighed in.
Yeah, he argued now is the time to support the ERLC, especially thinking about potential influence with the Trump administration. Shows the different political calculations at play.
It sounds like a really complex internal debate.
It is. You had that Center for Baptist Leadership criticizing the Baptist press for weaponizing empathy on immigration stories, and Leatherwood for supporting that reporting.
Wow.
But then you have someone like Dwight McKissick, a prominent black pastor, calling the ERLC the most racially progressive entity in the SBC, and worrying that the convention is moving towards a fundamentalism that could push away black churches. So very different views on what the ERLC represents.
Okay, so the ERLC survives, but with significant opposition. What else failed? The amendment about pastors?
Right, the constitutional amendment about women pastors. The proposal was to explicitly state in the SBC Constitution that only men can serve as any kind of pastor.
Because the current belief statement just says the office of pastor is limited to men, and there's disagreement on what office means, like lead pastor versus other roles.
Exactly. That's the crux of the debate. Does it apply only to the senior pastor or any staff member with the title pastor?
And this amendment failed.
It did. For the second year in a row, it actually got a majority vote. 61% were in favor.
But not enough.
Not enough. Amendments need a 2/3 majority. And interestingly, the sources note fewer messengers actually voted on it this year compared to last year when it also failed, but with slightly higher support then.
Why did proponents want this in the Constitution?
People like pastors Juan Sanchez and Adam Blosser argued it was about doctrinal clarity, making the rules explicit. Also about building trust that the executive committee would actually enforce the existing belief statement.
But there were arguments against putting it in the Constitution,
Yeah.
right, from the leadership.
Yeah, Jeff Iorg, the president of the executive committee, reportedly warned against it. He argued that putting this specific language in the Constitution could actually increase the risk of lawsuits against the SBC.
How so?
Might affect something called ecclesiastical abstention. That's the legal idea that courts generally stay out of internal church disputes about doctrine or governance. Iorg worried this could make them more vulnerable.
But not everyone agreed with that legal assessment.
No. Denny Burke, a biblical studies professor, argued that since the belief about male pastors is already in their official statement of faith, writing it into the Constitution wouldn't really add new legal danger, just clarifying what they already believe.
So another contentious issue without a decisive resolution this year. Anything else notable that failed?
The sources briefly mentioned that some proposals for sweeping new financial transparency requirements also didn't pass.
Okay, so consensus on external stances, but more division or inertia on internal reforms. Let's circle back to the abuse response. How did that play out in the convention's actual decisions, like finances?
Right. Well, the messengers did approve money for abuse-related costs, specifically $3 million from the budgeted giving of churches,
For what exactly?
for ongoing legal fees related to abuse cases. And the sources highlight this as significant because it's the first time regular giving dollars were allocated this way, before they drew from reserve funds.
Jeff Iyer, the EC president, put a number on that, didn't he? Like how much per offering dollar?
Yeah, he calculated it as about 30 cents for every $1,000 tithed in an SBC church. He also emphasized that they're focusing on developing training and resources around abuse prevention and care.
But what about the database?
That's the key point the sources make. Iorg reportedly didn't mention the lapsed plans for a database of credibly accused predators.
So funding the legal defense, focusing on training, but the mechanism for tracking abusers seems stalled.
That seems to be the takeaway from the reporting. And that contrasts sharply with what some survivor advocates are calling for.
Right, that's where you get the quotes about hollow words or phony dog and pony shows of reform. Krista Brown, an advocate, was quoted saying that. It shows deep frustration from some.
Definitely a disconnect there between the official actions and what some advocates see as necessary steps.
Looking at the bigger picture trends mentioned, attendance was down compared to historical peaks.
Yeah, about 10,500 messengers. Way down from the huge meetings decades ago during the conservative resurgence. But the sources also state that among those who do attend, the conservative consensus remains strong.
So fewer people, but maybe more ideologically aligned.
That could be one interpretation. And there were different takes on why some of these internal reforms failed. The new SBC president, Clint Presley, reportedly saw it as a sign of unity in the gospel, despite disagreements.
But others felt differently.
Yeah, the sources say some left with lingering questions or a feeling of unfinished business.
There was that quote from a Georgia pastor, Griffin Gulledge.
Right. His take was interesting. Said Southern Baptists get most excited about missions and ministry. They're willing to endure talk of reform but can't agree on what that reform is. Suggests maybe a weariness with the internal debates.
And finally, membership numbers versus baptisms. A mixed picture there.
Very mixed. Membership reportedly dropped again, down 2% in 2024. That's the 18th year in a row of decline. Total now around 12.7 million.
18 years is a long trend.
It is. But on the other hand, baptisms were up to over 250,000.
And that's significant.
Apparently so. It's higher than pre-pandemic levels, reversing a recent slide. Baptisms are often seen as a really key measure of spiritual health or evangelistic effectiveness in the SBC. So decline in one area, but a positive sign in another.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what's the snapshot we get from this deep dive into the sources? It feels complex.
Definitely complex. You see a denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, clearly wrestling with some major internal tensions, debates about its public policy arm, the ERLC, the ongoing arguments over women's roles in leadership.
And overshadowing it all, that painful, continuing fallout from the abuse crisis made so tragically real by Jennifer Lyell's death just before the meeting.
Exactly. But at the same time, you see this remarkable unity, this overwhelming consensus expressed on a whole range of social and ethical issues in those big resolutions.
Right. A strong commitment to certain interpretations of faith and clear calls for government action based on those interpretations. even if those stances put them out of step with parts of broader society.
And you've got the numbers telling two stories declining membership overall, but a recent uptick in baptisms. And this backdrop, where calls for internal reform, especially on abuse, seem to be hitting roadblocks, even while they're allocating money for the legal costs.
So this journey through the articles, it really shows you a denomination grappling with its identity, how it presents itself publicly, its own internal health.
Yeah, it highlights that challenge, doesn't it? Translating deeply held beliefs into collective action. And you see how much individual stories, like Lyell's, can impact such a massive institution.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on, drawing from all this.
Okay.
We saw this strong consensus on the resolutions defining, as they put it, God's design for society, marriage, gender, family, etc. But at the same time, a real struggle to get consensus on internal reforms, things like the abuse database or the specific requirements for pastors.
Right, that gap is noticeable.
So the question is, what does that gap between articulating external values so clearly and struggling to implement internal institutional changes? What might that tell us about how large organizations, whether they're faith-based or not, operate when they face these kinds of complex challenges and deeply held convictions?
That's a really interesting question to ponder. What drives consensus and what creates inertia?